There are cases that time tries to erase, but yellowed paper insists on remembering. Before continuing, the researcher who narrates this file leaves a simple observation, almost whispered in the margins of the document. Comment on which city you are watching and what time it is there. A brief request, which does not break the silence of history, but invites the reader to situate themselves in time. The case of the Redpeak sisters, as it was recorded decades later, is one of those episodes that lie among the forgotten pages of the archives of the old county of Harper's Fork, on the eastern border of the Appalachians. The year was 1901, and the mountains still retained a harsh rusticity, where small communities survived among narrow valleys, long winters, and the distant sound of axes clearing the virgin forest. Sisters Eveline and Marjorie Redpeak, both young adults, were well-known figures in the region. Daughters of a hunter who lost his life too soon, and a mother who struggled to keep the family together, the two grew up among trails, streams, and the fine dust of dirt roads. The surname Redpeak came from their grandfather, who used to say that the mountains changed color at sunset, as if they were breathing, a metaphor that would later take on a somber tone. Records from that time describe the sisters as hard-working, discreet, and deeply connected to each other. Eveline, the eldest, had a steady gaze and was known for her ability to track wounded animals. Marjorie, 3 years younger, possessed a lightness that contrasted with the harsh environment around her. She taught reading to the children at the chapel and took care of the family's beehives. Together, they managed the small rural property they had inherited, a simple wooden house, a narrow barn, and behind it, what decades later would be called in documents the silence shed. The shed was just an old outbuilding, maintained since their grandfather's time, used to store tools and dry hides. But in accounts collected years later, there are indications that the place took on a strange role in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Some neighbors in later statements mentioned seeing the sisters working there at night, with partially covered oil lamps. Others say they heard muffled sounds, perhaps footsteps, perhaps wood being dragged, but nothing that, at the time, warranted alarm. The community of Harper's Fork was small, isolated, and organized around hunters, loggers, and small farmers. The church was in the center of the village, and commerce was limited to a general store that also served as a post office. The Redpeak sisters went to the village only once a week, always together, walking along the narrow road that wound through tall pine trees. There was nothing to suggest that the two carried any conflict or secret greater than the everyday difficulties of the time. Still, as the records analyzed by the narrator-historian emerge, one detail stands out as the first noise in the silence of that year. It appeared in a simple document, an incomplete letter sent to the village store. The handwriting was Eveline Redpeak's. The destination, the captain of a group of hunters from Red Hollow, a region about 8 miles away. But the letter was never delivered. It was incomplete, unsigned, and ended abruptly, with a sentence that seemed to have been interrupted by something unexpected. If you can come before the end of the week, you will find what, and nothing else. The paper was found months later inside the silence shed itself, folded between loose floorboards. There were no erasures, no indication of haste, just a sudden interruption that, in light of what would come later, seemed to carry a strange weight. This small, seemingly mundane fragment became the first preserved clue to what would become the region's most enigmatic disappearance: the Redpeak sisters and the 48 hunters who went into the woods after them and never returned. And this is where the file opens for the first time. In the oldest archives preserved in Harper's Fork County, there is a series of reports about the weeks leading up to the Redpeak sisters' disappearance. Although written by different hands, a merchant, a distant neighbor, an itinerant pastor, they all carry the same sense of normality, and at the same time of something too discreet to be noticed at the time. The sisters' daily life was simple, hard, and predictable, like that of almost everyone who lived on the eastern slope of the Appalachians in the early 20th century. Eveline woke up before sunrise, lit the wood stove, and tended to the tools left by her father. Marjorie took care of the beehives. sewed clothes for church, and collected water from the creek. The forest was the constant backdrop to their lives, with noises that varied with the seasons: logs creaking in the cold, owls hooting, deer footsteps in the tall grass. For any resident of the region, these sounds evoked no mystery. They were just part of the living fabric of the mountain. But later testimonies indicate that even within this rigid routine, some subtle changes arose in the sisters' home. Too small to be interpreted at the time, but significant in light of what would happen. The first indication comes from the account of Abner Crowell, a neighboring farmer who, in a 1924 statement, said he noticed Eveline walking farther than usual, often carrying a burlap bag too full to contain only tools. He never asked what was in it. It was not customary to ask direct questions in Harper's Fork, but the memory remained clear to him. Eveline walked quickly, as if trying to gain time before something arrived faster than expected. Marjorie, on the other hand, began to spend more time in the shed, which decades later would be named the Silence Shed. One of the children from the chapel, now an adult when interviewed, recalls that Marjorie would arrive at class smelling strongly of turpentine, even on days when she wasn't painting anything. Turpentine wasn't something that was used in the shed, at least not until then. The warehouse records also contain notes about unusual purchases made by the two: longer ropes, extra lamps, small metal containers, and an above-average amount of salt for just two women. Salt was used for preservation, but this seemed beyond what was necessary. The merchant who recorded the sales simply wrote, "Perhaps they are preparing for winter," but winter was still far away. Their mother, who had died 3 years earlier, had left behind a reputation as a quiet, almost reclusive woman who rarely sought outside help. Eveline inherited this attitude. Marjorie, however, had always been more sociable. The sudden change in the younger sister's behavior, more reserved, less present in casual village conversations, was noticed by two women who attended church. One of them commented in a preserved statement that Marjorie seemed to carry something on her shoulders, like a heavy box that no one sees. It was during this same period that another record appeared, a brief appearance by a group of hunters from Red Hollow, who had stopped in the village to buy supplies. According to the store owner, Eveline spoke to the group's captain in a reserved, almost urgent manner. This account only gained relevance years later when the incomplete letter found in the shed was discovered. So far, nothing indicated any real danger, just fragments of routine that, when pieced together decades later, form a mosaic of silent concerns. The setting surrounding the sisters also influenced the atmosphere of the time. The year 1901 was marked by a prolonged drought in that region of the mountain range. The rivers were shallower, game was scarcer, and some loggers reported hearing their footsteps echoing unusually among valleys that had previously muffled the sound. A Methodist pastor noted in his notebook that the air seemed thinner in that early autumn, as if the mountains were waiting for something before closing the doors of winter. Without realizing it, the entire community was approaching a breaking point. At the end of September, Eveline stopped showing up in the village for 2 weeks in a row, something that had never happened before. Marjorie began walking alone, her hands always trembling, as if she expected someone to be watching her. And then 2 testimonies emerge that, although brief, become fundamental to the narrator's historical reconstruction. The first came from a hunter who had passed by the road at dawn and said he had seen the sisters in the field behind the house, staring intently at the woods, as if waiting for a sign from there. The second, from an older woman, claimed to have heard a muffled argument between the two on a night when the wind carried sounds more clearly. She did not understand the words, but she recognized tension, a tension that did not match the strong bond they had. These details, isolated and scattered, took on new meaning only after the disappearance, and it is precisely at this moment, when these fragments begin to align, that the historical record points to the last known day of the Redpeak sisters in Harper's Fork, a day that ironically began like any other, until it ceased to be. And here the archive abruptly ends, leaving room for the reconstruction of that sequence of events that, even today, remains shrouded in silence. The last day of the Redpeak sisters in Harper's Fork begins to be reconstructed from three main sources: the incomplete records of the local pastor, the testimony of a lumberjack passing through the region, and a fragment of a county patrol report. Separately, these documents seem inconsistent. Together, they form the blurred outline of what became the central point of the case. The morning of October 12, 1901, dawned with an unusual fog, described by residents as too thick for the season. The air seemed still, and even the crickets fell silent earlier than usual. At 6:30, Pastor John Merritt reported seeing Marjorie walking toward the creek with a bucket, but something bothered him. She wasn't wearing the blue scarf she always used to protect her hair from the dew, and her steps were short and hesitant, as if she were counting each movement. Around 7 o'clock, Evelyn was seen at the entrance to the village, standing in front of the closed store. The owner, Abner Holt, says she didn't knock on the door. She just stood there for a few moments, looking inside as if trying to record an image for the last time. When he opened the door a few minutes later, she had already disappeared. These small oddities, recorded later, gained relevance when it was discovered that neither of them returned to the village that day. The reconstruction continues with the testimony of Silas Bram, a traveling lumberjack who worked on the southern slope of the mountain. He stated that at noon he heard the rhythmic sound of lamps being lit inside a shed, an unusual sound for that time of day, and that when he looked in the direction of the Redpeak property, he saw a thin column of smoke escaping through the cracks in the roof of the silent shed. It is important to note that, according to Silas's own account, the smoke did not smell like burning wood or skin. It was more, almost metallic, as if something were being slowly heated. This detail, the metallic smell, would be echoed in other testimonies. However, none of them point to anything that the community could interpret as dangerous at that time. In the late afternoon, the last confirmed report of the sisters' presence emerges. A woman named Cordelia Haskell, who lived half a mile from the Redpeaks, said she saw the two walking together along the fence that bordered the property. The sun was already low, casting long shadows among the trees. Cordelia recalled that Marjorie was carrying something covered with a dark cloth, possibly one of the lanterns, while Evelyn kept her head down, staring at the ground in front of her as if looking for some mark. The scene lasted only seconds, but decades later, Cordelia described Evelyn's expression as a warning that no one heard. From that point on, the case has no direct witnesses, and then, in later records, the event that changes everything emerges. The next morning, a group of hunters from Red Hollow, 48 experienced men, including Captain Jacob Merton, who had sporadic communication with Evelyn, arrived in the village. They were responding to a call that no one there understood. The captain carried with him a copy of the incomplete letter Evelyn had written weeks earlier, annotated in the margin with the phrase, "She asked for urgency." The hunters said they intended to go to the sisters' property to check what was happening. The village, perplexed, was unable to offer any concrete information. No one knew that Evelyn had tried to contact them. No one had received her request. And even stranger, no one could explain why the message seemed more like a warning than an invitation. The county patrol, in a brief, almost bureaucratic record, noted the passage of the large group toward the denser trails of the forest. The 48 footprints were seen following the narrow path that led to the Redpeak house. After that, the evidence becomes fragmented, but the narrator-historian reconstructs the order of events based on the traces found weeks later. When the hunters arrived at the property, they found no one there. The door to the house was unlocked. There were dishes on the table and a blanket still warm near the stove. The shed, however, was locked from the inside. Here appears the last physical trace that still causes discomfort to researchers. Deep, salt marks scattered across the floor, forming an irregular trail that ran from the door of the house to the shed. The presence of salt in such large quantities was unusual. The hunters noted this, but did not understand its significance. Some men tried to open the shed, When they finally succeeded, they found the interior empty, too empty. Tools that should have been there had been removed. Drawers were ransacked. Floorboards were loose. And in the center, there were marks that looked like oil lamps burning for a long time, as if someone had been working there for several nights in a row. But the most disturbing detail was described by 3 members of the group. The metallic smell, almost imperceptible, that seemed to mix with the cold air of early fall. After searching the area, the hunters decided to enter the woods in search of the sisters. They followed a set of footprints that branched off several times, as if Eveline and Marjorie had walked in a deliberately confusing manner. The initial trail had 2 female footprints, then only 1, then none. The 48 hunters entered the mountain in silence. They were never seen again. This is the critical point in the historical record. The last confirmed evidence of the entire group was the set of 48 footprints entering the dense forest. There is no record of their return, no subsequent witnesses, no physical traces found in subsequent expeditions. And it is here, exactly here, that the narrator-historian interrupts his reconstruction and records the last sentence found in the original county document, a sentence written on the back of the report without a signature. The silence of the mountain began in the shed, when the prolonged absence of the 48 hunters began to become impossible to ignore. The village entered a state of silent unease. In Harper's Fork, it was common for men to spend days or even weeks in the woods during periods of intense hunting, but no group this large had ever disappeared without at least leaving a sign of their return. As the days turned into 2 weeks, uncertainty spread like a kind of emotional fog that crept into every home, every lit stove, every whispered conversation. The first search expeditions organized by the residents were small, 5 or 6 men at a time, following the same path the hunters had taken. But, as the archives record, something on the trail seemed too different for the teams to proceed with peace of mind. One of the searchers wrote that the forest was silent in a way I have never seen in these mountains. The same phrase appears in 2 other testimonies, which still intrigues historians today. How could 3 different people, in different years, use exactly the same expression? Initial searches found only scattered traces, a broken arrow, boot prints crushing dry leaves, remains of old campfires that did not belong to the group. But there were no bodies, personal belongings, or recent signs to confirm any destination. The strangest thing is that the tracks seemed to stop abruptly at certain points, as if everything simply ceased there. It was at this point, in the face of growing pressure from the community, that the county authorized a broader official search. The report of this operation is one of the documents most studied by researchers of the Redpeak case. It describes 3 discoveries that shaped the historical narrative of the disappearance. The first discovery was made near a narrow stream, just over a mile from the sisters' home. Among bushes and rocks, they found a piece of torn fabric, brown, sturdy, part of the typical uniform of Red Hollow hunters. But the fabric showed no signs of struggle or blood. It was as if it had been torn off by mistake in a narrow passage. The name Merton was hand-embroidered in the lower corner of the piece. This was the only personal item directly associated with Captain Jacob Merton, and he was never seen again. The second discovery came 3 days later in a higher area of the hillside. There, the men found what appeared to be a circle of salt, partially dissolved by moisture, with 2 extinguished oil lamps in the center. The lanterns were identical to those Eveline used to buy at the store. The presence of salt caused discomfort among the residents. In the region, salt was used for preservation, to scare away animals, or to staunch blood, but never in circles. The report mentions the discovery without speculation. It merely records the strangeness in a dry, bureaucratic manner. The third discovery, however, was the one that sparked debate for decades afterward. At the foot of the mountain, where the trail narrowed between 2 large rocks, the teams found a broken board, clearly torn from the floor of the silent shed. The wood still contained traces of the metallic smell that had been reported by the first hunters. No one could explain how that board had ended up so far from the property. Some suggested that it could have been carried by water, but there were no streams capable of moving it that far. Testimonies from residents collected in the following years add even more human and painful layers to the story. One woman reported that Marjorie had confided to her weeks earlier that something in the woods was different, but did not explain what. A young man claimed to have seen Eveline talking to herself near the shed, although he himself acknowledged that it could have been just the echo of her voice. Others spoke of smoke at night, metallic sounds coming from the direction of the house, and the glow of lanterns that seemed to remain lit until well after midnight. Despite so many disconnected clues, no solid explanation emerged. As the months passed, the official search dwindled. The families of the 48 hunters pressured the county, but with no new leads, only sadness remained. The silence of the mountains seeped into the houses, and the name Redpeak began to carry an uncomfortable weight among the residents. Some families began to avoid the trail that led to the sisters' property. Others forbade their children from playing near the creek. It was not until early 1902, almost 4 months after the disappearance, that the county drafted its final report on the case. It officially ended the search and declared the region unstable for extensive expeditions at this time. Among the last pages, one passage still catches the attention of researchers today. It is impossible to determine the fate of the group of hunters or the Redpeak sisters with the available evidence. All traces lead to inconclusive noises, marks that begin and end without apparent logic, and testimonies that suggest more questions than answers. There are no survivors, nor witnesses to the outcome. This cold administrative conclusion contrasts with the emotional impact the case had on the community. The mother of 2 of the hunters spent years going to the edge of the trail and leaving lit lanterns, hoping that someone would return. One of Merton's brothers returned to the village several times to try to find any new clues. When interviewed decades later, residents still lowered their voices when mentioning the sisters' names. And here, at the end of the block, the narrator-historian presents the most human and plausible revelation that the documents allow. Perhaps the Redpeak sisters were trying to protect the village from something, not something supernatural, but human. A conflict, a risk, a threat that was never explained. Eveline's incomplete letter, the salt, the lamps, the broken trails, everything indicates that they knew something was coming, but they failed to prevent the outcome. The last sentence of the 1902 file is simple but haunting, handwritten by someone on the search team. The silence that remained was not from the forest. It was from the people who did not return. Some files age like wood, exposed to the elements. They crack, lose color, break in silent spots. The case of the Redpeak sisters, however, has not aged. It has remained suspended, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a wound that has never found the language to heal. When the narrator-historian opens the last folder from Harper's Fork County, almost 3 decades later, he realizes that he is not looking at a set of documents about a disappearance. He is looking at an absence that has become part of local history. The old county no longer exists in the same way. The church where Marjorie taught reading was rebuilt after a fire in 1914. The store has changed hands 3 times. The road that once wound alone among pine trees now welcomes occasional travelers' wagons. But when someone mentions the name Redpeak, there is a brief moment of silence, an inherited silence, passed down as a memory that no one has experienced directly, but everyone recognizes. It is in this silence that the researcher finds the strongest emotional thread of the case. Revisiting the sites of the 1929 disappearance, he describes the sisters' property as a place where time seems to have taken 2 steps back. The house was still standing, though leaning. The shed, the old silent shed, had lost part of its roof, but inexplicably retained the same feeling recorded 28 years earlier. A heavy air, not because of mysticism, but because of the number of stories that were never told inside. The researcher walks through the interior and observes the floorboards, some still marked by old cuts. He finds the central space where, according to the testimonies, the lamps burned for successive nights. There are no traces of salt, nor any recent marks. The metallic smell, mentioned so often in the original reports, has dissipated decades ago. But something remains, the impression that this place was not the scene of a single event, but rather a sequence of difficult decisions made by the two young women. It is a thought that hangs over the entire narrative. Eveline and Marjorie were not passive victims of an inexplicable event. Everything indicates that they were responding to something, perhaps a threat that never made it into the documents, perhaps a risk that only they perceived, perhaps just an error in judgment that escalated until it spiraled out of control. The narrator historian makes no claims, he merely suggests what the records make possible. Decades later, the community still preserves fragmented memories. An elder says he remembers his father describing a night when the lanterns shone in the wrong direction. A woman says her grandmother cried when passing by the old road without ever saying why. No one mentions the hunters directly, as if they recognize that mourning for such a large group has become something collective and silent, easier to bear among everyone than to try to understand alone. The researcher also finds, inside a cardboard box forgotten in the basement of the city hall, a small note that never made it into the final report. It is a folded sheet of paper, dated 1903, written by someone who participated in the search. The note simply says, "They didn't run away. They tried to buy time." This sentence changes the tone of everything. It doesn't explain, but it shifts the weight of the case. If the sisters were trying to buy time, for what? For whom? Against whom? Historical logic offers no answers, and perhaps that is precisely why the case entered regional memory not as an enigma, but as a shared silence, something that finds no form, only permanence. At the close of the file, near the end of the 1920s, the researcher writes his last paragraph. He does not attempt to organize conclusions. He does not attempt to offer theories. He simply returns to the mountain what the documents could not hold. When I revisited the field behind the house, the wind made the same sound described in the first reports. A brief, thin sound that passes between the trees like someone who does not want to be seen. I realized that the silence of this story does not belong to the sisters, nor to the hunters, nor to the shed. It belongs to time. And time does not return answers, only echoes. The text ends without a period, just a broken line, as if the researcher had suddenly stopped writing. It may have been a stylistic choice, or just the inevitable end of an unfinished narrative, but the effect is the same. There is a void that the viewer feels, that the community feels, that the mountain seems to have absorbed. And so, after 3 decades of documents, scraps of memories, inconclusive testimonies, and accumulating absences, the story of the Redpeak sisters does not end. It simply dissolves, like fog in the early morning, like faint smoke escaping through the cracks of an old shed, like footsteps entering the forest with no return. The narrator historian closes the file and writes his last sentence. Some silences do not require explanation, only respect. And the voice falls silent,